Carlos, an old man, felt lonely despite all the wealth in his bank account. Despite having money, he wanted the closeness of his family, who remained distant. However, he met Letitia, a 19-year-old girl, and soon promised that he would leave her a part of his fortune on the day she received the will. I couldn't believe what was written. In an imposing mansion, located in the city's most upscale neighborhood, lived Mr. Carlos, a 75-year-old man with a discreet presence, but a great story. Widowed for more than a decade, he lived in the house that was once full of laughter and voices, now resounding only with the echoes of his memories. His wife, the heiress of one of the country's richest families, had left not only a considerable fortune but also a void that was difficult to fill. Carlos, with his silver hair and still alive eyes, hid a significant part of this fortune, preferring to keep the financial details secret even from his own children. Carlos had 5 children, all successful in their own lives, but distant from their father. They rarely visited him, busy with their careers and families, leaving him increasingly lonely. He missed the times when the house was full, with young children running through the hallways and family meals eaten around the big dining table. Now, he was content with the daily presence of his faithful maid, Anna, and his talented cook, Mariana. The 2 women were more than employees. They were, in a way, his surrogate family. With her robust figure and warm smile, Anna arrived every morning to tidy the house. She knew every corner, every piece of furniture, every secret kept in the old drawers. Mariana, on the other hand, was a soft-spoken woman with skilled hands who prepared favorite comfort dishes through food. Together, they filled Carlos' days with a bit of routine and human warmth. Despite all the care, the loneliness persisted. Carlos often spent hours in his office, surrounded by photographs of his late wife and children at various stages of their lives. He called his children, tried to connect, but almost always found only the cold message boxes. In contrast, his grandson Pedro was a brilliant exception. Young, dynamic, and always busy with college and work, Pedro never forgot his grandfather. He always found time to call, see how he was doing, listen to his stories, and share a little of his own life. Pedro's presence was a relief from the windows of light breaking through the gloom of his lonely days. Pedro was genuinely interested in his grandfather's stories about the family's golden times, about the challenges and triumphs, and even about the little everyday things. He was a curious young man, with a kind spirit, who saw his grandfather as a source of wisdom and inspiration. However, there was something else that bothered Carlos. The question of his hidden fortune from his children was a constant source of concern. He feared that by revealing the full extent of his wealth, his children would come closer just out of interest. He wanted to believe that love and closeness could not be bought, thus remaining silent, protecting not only his fortune, but the essence of his family relationships. Deep in his heart, Carlos dreamed of a reunion. He dreamed of the house once again full of laughter and lively conversation, with the family gathered around the table. He dreamed of feeling the warmth of the embrace of his children and grandchildren, not out of obligation, but out of true and unconditional love. While he waited, he clung to the small joys he still had left, such as Pedro's sporadic visits, Anna and Mariana's dedicated care, and the memories he cherished. Despite his distance from his children, Carlos remained active and present in his own life. Every morning, just after the sun rose over the horizon, he would put on his hiking shoes and walk through the quiet streets of the neighborhood. It was a sacred ritual, a way to connect with the world around you and stay healthy physically and mentally. With each step, I observed the well-kept houses with their flower gardens and greeted the neighbors with a friendly wave. Between these morning walks, he cultivated small friendships, exchanging stories and smiles with those who crossed his path. However, No matter how hard he tried to maintain a serene appearance, Carlos carried with him a silent pain, a wound that never completely healed. He wondered what he had done wrong and what could have been different to keep his children close. Despite his loneliness, he did not give in to despair, maintaining a disciplined routine, eating well, cultivating his personal interests, and always seeking a connection with the outside world. Carlos attended classical music concerts, where he found temporary solace in the beauty of the notes and the harmony of the melodies. He also dedicated himself to reading, losing himself in worlds of fiction that transported him beyond the walls of his lonely house. However, it was in the quietest moments that loneliness was most present, echoing in the empty corridors and walls that held more memories than he could bear. At these times, he took refuge in his office, where the photographs of his family silently looked at the smiling faces of his children as children, trying to find some answer there to the inexplicable separation. Despite everything, Carlos never lost hope. The family flame still burned in his heart, warming him on the coldest nights. He believed that one day the love that united that family would be strong to overcome any distance. Until that day arrived, he clung to the comforting presence of Pedro, his beloved grandson, who, despite his busy life, always found time to be by his side. Pedro was her anchor in the world, her living hope that family love could overcome all adversity. A new day had already begun when, suddenly, bad luck knocked on Mr. Carlos' door. On a morning like any other, he headed to the bathroom after his morning walk. As he was getting out of the shower, a slip caused him to lose his balance and fall to the cold floor. The impact was brutal and he felt a sharp pain run through his left leg. Mariana, the dedicated cook, heard the crash and ran to help him. With care and affection, she helped him to his feet, but it was clear that something was wrong. Carlos felt a stab of unbearable pain in his ankle, and the mere idea of trying to move seemed like an impossible task. With a worried look, Mariana didn't hesitate, helped him sit down and immediately called an ambulance. At the hospital, Carlos was examined and subjected to a series of tests. The diagnosis was not as serious as initially imagined. He had merely sprained his ankle. Still, the fall and the pain were a painful reminder of her fragility, both physical and emotional. With a heavy heart, Carlos decided to inform the entire family about what had happened. He called each of his children, trying to hide the concern in his voice. On the other hand, those he received were cold and disinterested. Some barely paid attention to the news, while others just murmured a few words of comfort before resuming their busy lives. Carlos felt helpless and abandoned. The loneliness that enveloped him was almost palpable, as if he was slowly suffocating. He wondered where he had gone wrong and why his own children seemed so distant and indifferent. That physical pain now mixed with emotional pain, forming an unbearable burden on his tired shoulders. That same afternoon, the door to the hospital room opened and Pedro rushed in. His face was pale and his eyes showed genuine concern. He had left work and commitments behind as soon as he received the news and rushed to see his grandfather. Upon seeing Carlos, who was lying on the bed with a tired expression, Pedro quickly approached, holding his hand. "Grandpa, how are you? Are you feeling a lot of pain? Do you need anything?" asked Pedro, his voice full of anxiety. Carlos smiled calmly, despite the pain he felt in his ankle and the weight of loneliness that accompanied it. "I'm fine, my boy. It was just a scare and my ankle hurts a little, but the doctors have already given me medicine for the pain. I'll be better soon." Pedro breathed a sigh of relief, but he didn't fail to notice the sadness in his grandfather's eyes. "I'll stay here with you tonight. Don't worry about anything. I've got your back." Pedro's presence brought immense comfort to Carlos, who felt welcomed and loved throughout the night. The young grandson settled into a chair next to the bed, refusing to leave even when the nurses insisted he go home to rest. Pedro's dedication was a source of joy for Carlos, a reminder that there was still someone who truly cared. While Pedro slept in his improvised chair, Carlos spent the night in thought. The pain in her ankle was a constant discomfort, but nothing compared to the emotional pain she felt when she realized her children were gone. He remembered the times he had sacrificed himself to ensure that they lacked nothing, in addition to the affection and love he dedicated to each of them. Now, however, he felt abandoned, as if all these efforts meant nothing. In that same uncomfortable chair, Pedro represented everything that was still worth fighting for. He was living proof that love still existed, even if it was only found in one family member. Carlos knew he couldn't change the past or his children's attitudes, but he could value and nurture the special relationship he had with Pedro. The night in the hospital was long and lonely for Carlos. Pedro slept in the next chair, while Carlos kept his gaze fixed on the door, hoping that one of his other children would appear. He longed to see a familiar face and hear a voice that brought comfort, but the night passed and the door remained closed, with no one else crossing it. In a moment of weakness, Carlos let some tears escape, feeling the weight of loneliness and rejection. Then, looking at Pedro, who was sleeping uncomfortably in the chair, he wiped away his tears and found strength in his gratitude. From that day on, Carlos decided that he would not allow the absence of his children to get him down. Instead, he would focus on what was good in his life: a wonderful, devoted grandson who loved him sincerely. Pedro's presence was a precious gift, and he promised himself that he would cherish every moment with his grandson. The next morning, the doctor entered the room with a professional but friendly expression. "Mr. Carlos, I have good news. You are free to go home, but your ankle will need physical therapy to fully recover." Carlos nodded, relieved to be able to return to the comfort of his home. Pedro quickly got up, ready to help his grandfather. "Come on, Grandpa. I'll take care of everything." Pedro provided the discharge papers and carefully helped Carlos get dressed and ready to leave. Together, they left the hospital and returned to the imposing house that Carlos lived in. When he arrived, Ana and Mariana were at the door, anxious and relieved to see him. "Thank God you're okay," Ana exclaimed, while Mariana, with tears in her eyes, gently hugged Carlos. He smiled at his two loyal employees and friends. "Thank you, my dears. I'm better, thanks to you and Pedro." Pedro helped Carlos settle into his favorite armchair in the living room. The tiredness of the night before weighed heavily on both of them, but there was a sense of relief in the air. They knew recovery would be a slow process, but they were determined to face it together. During the days that followed, Carlos began his recovery with the constant support of Pedro, Ana, and Mariana. Physiotherapy sessions would only begin the following week, and each day was a step towards her goal. Every little progress was celebrated. Pedro accompanied his grandfather every day, helping him with everything he needed. Between their daily care, Carlos and Pedro further strengthened the bond that united them. They spent hours talking and sharing stories and laughs. Carlos taught Pedro about the family secrets, the life lessons he had learned over the years, and Pedro, in turn, brought new perspectives and energy to Carlos' life. Upon learning of the accident, Pedro took a few days off from work to take care of his grandfather. Carlos initially protested, saying he didn't want to disturb his grandson's busy life, but Pedro insisted with a stubborn smile. "Grandpa, I want to be here. It's important to me." Carlos, moved by Pedro's dedication, gave in and allowed him to stay at his home for a few days. The following week, Carlos needed to take care of some financial matters. Pedro, always helpful, offered to go to the bank in his place, trusting his grandson completely. Carlos handed over his bank account password and explained what needed to be done. Pedro took the documents and went to the bank, determined to help his grandfather with everything he needed. When he arrived at the bank and accessed Carlos' account, Pedro was shocked by what he saw. The account balance was astronomical, much higher than he had imagined. He knew that his grandfather had a comfortable life financially, but he had no idea of the true extent of his fortune. The amount was impressive, a sum that could change anyone's life. He felt a whirlwind of emotions. On the one hand, he was impressed and a little confused. On the other, he felt an even greater responsibility to take care of his grandfather. He knew that with that amount also came risks and the need to protect Carlos from any malicious person. Pedro took care of the banking matters as his grandfather had asked and returned home with his documents in order, but with a growing concern on his mind. When he arrived home, he found Carlos sitting in the living room, reading a book. The grandfather looked up and smiled when he saw Pedro enter. "Did you manage to resolve everything, my boy?" asked Carlos. Pedro nodded, but couldn't hide the concern in his eyes. "Yes, Grandpa, everything is resolved, but I was surprised to see your account balance. I didn't know you had so much money." Carlos sighed and closed the book, placing it on his lap. "I never wanted you or your brothers to know the true extent of my fortune." His grandmother, God rest his soul, was the heiress of one of the richest families in the country. When she passed away, she left me a large sum, as well as real estate and jewelry. I thought that if your brothers knew, they might withdraw even further, thinking only about the money. I wanted them to get closer out of love, not out of interest. Pedro sat next to his grandfather, holding his hand. "I understand, Grandpa, and I know you did what you thought was best. But I also think it's important to protect what you've built. Especially now, you are not alone and I am here to help." Carlos smiled, shaking his grandson's hand gratefully. "Thank you, Pedro. I trust you more than anyone else. Knowing that you are by my side gives me a peace that I haven't felt in a long time." The next day, first thing in the morning, Carlos would start his physiotherapy sessions to recover his ankle once and for all. Early in the morning, the physiotherapist arrived. She was a young 19-year-old girl called Letitia, with a warm smile and contagious energy. She greeted Carlos with a firm handshake and began the physiotherapy session with an attention and dedication that soon won over the old gentleman. "Let's start slowly, okay? I want to make sure you feel comfortable and safe," said Letitia after introducing herself. Carlos nodded, immediately feeling at ease with the young woman. During the session, Letitia talked animatedly, asking about Carlos' life, his experiences, and life stories. Letitia showed genuine interest in what he was saying, which made Carlos open up and share some of the most memorable moments of his life. Between exercises and stretches, he shared details about his youth, how he met his late wife, and the joys and challenges of raising his children. "You have a very beautiful house, Mr. Carlos," Letitia commented during a pause. "I really like the details in the decoration. It's all so welcoming and elegant." Carlos smiled proudly. "Thank you, Letitia. My wife had refined taste. She took care of every detail. Now, this house is a constant reminder of her love and dedication." In the days that followed, Letitia returned for more physiotherapy sessions. With each meeting, the bond between them grew stronger. Letitia made a point of asking about Carlos' interests, passions, and dreams. He, in turn, loved the company and the opportunity to share his stories and wisdom. "Mr. Carlos, have you ever thought about writing a book about your life? Your stories are fascinating," suggested Letitia in one of the sessions. Carlos laughed, shaking his head. "I never thought about it, but it's an interesting idea. Who knows, maybe one day, with your help, I can put these stories on paper." Letitia smiled. "I would love to help, and I'm sure many people would be inspired by your journey." Physiotherapy sessions became a highlight of Carlos' days. not only because of the physical improvement he was feeling, but also because of the bond he was forming with Letitia. She brought new light to his routine, something he didn't know was missing until then. Pedro also noticed the difference in his grandfather's disposition. "Grandpa, I see that physiotherapy is doing you good and it looks like you found a great friend in Letitia," commented Pedro. Carlos smiled at his grandson. "Yes, Pedro. Letitia is a charming young woman. She reminds me that there is still so much to live for, so much to fight for, and her visits are a real relief to my lonely soul." With Pedro's constant support and Letitia's careful attention, Carlos began to see his life with new eyes. He realized that, despite the absences and pain of the past, there was still much to be experienced and shared. He decided to make the most of every moment, valuing the small joys and new friendships that emerged. The days continued to pass, and Carlos gradually recovered. With each session, Letitia encouraged him to take another step and achieve new goals. With each small victory, Carlos felt stronger, not just physically, but emotionally as well. After several sessions, Carlos noticed a special sparkle in Letitia's eyes, which beyond simple professional concern, demonstrated something deeper. One day, at the end of one of the sessions, she surprised him with an unexpected invitation. "Mr. Carlos, would you like to have dinner with me tonight?" asked Letitia with a soft smile. Carlos was startled, and his eyebrows rose in surprise. "Grandpa, I want to be here. It's important to me." Carlos, moved by Pedro's dedication, gave in and allowed him to stay at his home for a few days. The following week, Carlos needed to take care of some financial matters. Pedro, always helpful, offered to go to the bank in his place, trusting his grandson completely. Carlos handed over his bank account password and explained what needed to be done. Pedro took the documents and went to the bank, determined to help his grandfather with everything he needed. When he arrived at the bank and accessed Carlos' account, Pedro was shocked by what he saw. The account balance was astronomical, much higher than he had imagined. He knew that his grandfather had a comfortable life financially, but he had no idea of the true extent of his fortune. The amount was impressive, a sum that could change anyone's life. He felt a whirlwind of emotions. On the one hand, he was impressed and a little confused. On the other, he felt an even greater responsibility to take care of his grandfather. He knew that with that amount also came risks and the need to protect Carlos from any malicious person. Pedro took care of the banking matters as his grandfather had asked and returned home with his documents in order, but with a growing concern on his mind. When he arrived home, he found Carlos sitting in the living room, reading a book. The grandfather looked up and smiled when he saw Pedro enter. "Did you manage to resolve everything, my boy?" asked Carlos. Pedro nodded, but couldn't hide the concern in his eyes. "Yes, Grandpa, everything is resolved, but I was surprised to see your account balance. I didn't know you had so much money." Carlos sighed and closed the book, placing it on his lap. "I never wanted you or your brothers to know the true extent of my fortune." His grandmother, God rest his soul, was the heiress of one of the richest families in the country. When she passed away, she left me a large sum, as well as real estate and jewelry. I thought that if your brothers knew, they might withdraw even further, thinking only about the money. I wanted them to get closer out of love, not out of interest. Pedro sat next to his grandfather, holding his hand. "I understand, Grandpa, and I know you did what you thought was best. But I also think it's important to protect what you've built. Especially now, you are not alone and I am here to help." Carlos smiled, shaking his grandson's hand gratefully. "Thank you, Pedro. I trust you more than anyone else. Knowing that you are by my side gives me a peace that I haven't felt in a long time." The next day, first thing in the morning, Carlos would start his physiotherapy sessions to recover his ankle once and for all. Early in the morning, the physiotherapist arrived. She was a young 19-year-old girl called Lidisha, with a warm smile and contagious energy. She greeted Carlos with a firm handshake and began the physiotherapy session with an attention and dedication that soon won over the old gentleman. "Let's start slowly, okay? I want to make sure you feel comfortable and safe," said Lidisha after introducing herself. Carlos nodded, immediately feeling at ease with the young woman. During the session, Lidisha talked animatedly, asking about Carlos' life, his experiences, and life stories. Lidisha showed genuine interest in what he was saying, which made Carlos open up and share some of the most memorable moments of his life. Between exercises and stretches, he shared details about his youth, how he met his late wife, and the joys and challenges of raising his children. "You have a very beautiful house, Mr. Carlos," Lidisha commented during a pause. "I really like the details in the decoration. It's all so welcoming and elegant." Carlos smiled proudly. "Thank you, Lidisha. My wife had refined taste. She took care of every detail. Now, this house is a constant reminder of her love and dedication." In the days that followed, Lidisha returned for more physiotherapy sessions. With each meeting, the bond between them grew stronger. Lidisha made a point of asking about Carlos' interests, passions, and dreams. He, in turn, loved the company and the opportunity to share his stories and wisdom. "Mr. Carlos, have you ever thought about writing a book about your life? Your stories are fascinating," suggested Lidisha in one of the sessions. Carlos laughed, shaking his head. "I never thought about it, but it's an interesting idea. Who knows, maybe one day, with your help, I can put these stories on paper." Lidisha smiled. "I would love to help, and I'm sure many people would be inspired by your journey." Physiotherapy sessions became a highlight of Carlos' days, not only because of the physical improvement he was feeling, but also because of the bond he was forming with Lidisha. She brought new light to his routine, something he didn't know was missing until then. Pedro also noticed the difference in his grandfather's disposition. "Grandpa, I see that physiotherapy is doing you good, and it looks like you found a great friend in Lidisha," commented Pedro. Carlos smiled at his grandson. "Yes, Pedro. Lidisha is a charming young woman. She reminds me that there is still so much to live for, so much to fight for, and her visits are a real relief to my lonely soul." With Pedro's constant support and Lidisha's careful attention, Carlos began to see his life with new eyes. He realized that, despite the absences and pain of the past, there was still much to be experienced and shared. He decided to make the most of every moment, valuing the small joys and new friendships that emerged. The days continued to pass, and Carlos gradually recovered. With each session, Lidisha encouraged him to take another step and achieve new goals. With each small victory, Carlos felt stronger, not just physically, but emotionally as well. After several sessions, Carlos noticed a special sparkle in Lidisha's eyes, which beyond simple professional concern, demonstrated something deeper. One day, at the end of one of the sessions, she surprised him with an unexpected invitation. "Mr. Carlos, would you like to have dinner with me tonight?" asked Lidisha with a soft smile. Carlos was startled, and his eyebrows rose in surprise. "Me, an old man like me? Why would a young woman like you want to go out with me?" He was genuinely confused, feeling unsure about what Letitia really wanted. Lidisha smiled even more, with a look full of understanding and tenderness. "The body ages, but the spirit always remains young. Mr. Carlos, you have a vibrant soul, full of stories and wisdom. I would love to spend time with you outside of a professional environment." He gave happiness a chance. Carlos was shaken by the sincerity of her words. He had never considered this possibility, but after a brief hesitation, He felt warmed by Letitia's kindness and invitation. "Very good, Letitia. I accept your invitation." That night, they went to a cozy restaurant. Carlos, in an elegant suit that he hadn't worn in a long time, and Letitia, stunning in a simple but elegant dress. During dinner, the conversation flowed naturally. They laughed, shared stories, and discovered a deep connection. Carlos felt rejuvenated by Letitia's company, and she, in turn, appreciated his wisdom and charm. As time passed, the meetings became frequent. They had dinner together regularly, and Carlos began buying clothes not only for himself, but also for Letitia, as a gesture of affection and appreciation. The two developed a deep bond, sharing secrets and dreams. Letitia found Carlos an inexhaustible source of stories and learning, while he delighted in her energy and vitality. One day, while they were walking through the park, Letitia held Carlos' hand and looked into his eyes. "Carlos, I want you to know that what I feel for you is real. It's not just admiration or respect, it's something deeper." Carlos squeezed her hand, feeling a wave of emotion. "Letitia, I also feel something very special for you. You brought new light into my life, something I didn't expect to find at this stage." Despite the deep intimacy they shared, Carlos never revealed the true extent of his fortune to Letitia. He wanted the relationship to be based on genuine feelings, without the influence of material wealth. He continued to live modestly, hiding the true situation of his bank account. As Carlos and Letitia's relationship blossomed, she eventually moved into his house. Carlos was radiant with her presence, feeling rejuvenated and full of happiness. However, Letitia's change did not go unnoticed by Carlos' children, who began to question her intentions, one by one. They reached out to Letitia, expressing their concerns and suspicions. They thought she was only interested in Carlos' fortune and not in her father as a person. However, Carlos remained firm in his decision, defending the love he felt for Letitia and his choice to have her in his life. Although he deeply wanted his father's happiness, he also found himself torn. On the one hand, I saw the joy that Letitia brought to Carlos' life, but on the other, I understood the concerns of his parents and siblings. He wanted to believe in true love between his father and Letitia, but doubts persisted in his mind. As the months passed, Carlos realized the discomfort and tension that his relationship with Letitia caused in the family. He understood their concerns, but his conviction in the love he shared with Letitia remained unshakable. One day, Carlos called Pedro for a serious conversation. Sitting in the living room, Carlos looked seriously into his grandson's eyes and took a deep breath before starting to speak, feeling the weight of the words that were about to come out. "Pedro, my boy, there is something I need to tell you, something that may shock everyone." His voice trembled slightly, but he continued steadily. "I decided to sell this house and move to your apartment because I no longer have money." Pedro's eyes widened, full of surprise, without expecting that revelation. He looked at his grandfather with a mixture of perplexity and curiosity. "Sell the house? But why, Grandpa?" Carlos sighed, feeling the weight of the secret he carried. I can't keep this house anymore. I can no longer sustain the lifestyle we live here. I'm broke." Pedro was shocked by the revelation. He knew that Carlos' fortune was great, but he never imagined that it was in danger. He was silent for a moment, processing his grandfather's words. Then, finally, he approached Carlos and held his hands. "Grandpa, no matter what happens, I will be by your side. I will help you with everything. Come live with me and don't worry about money." "Thank you very much, Pedro. I don't even know what to say," Carlos replied. A few days later, Pedro decided to face the situation head-on. He posted a simple message in the family group, but one that would make a big impact. Mr. Carlos decided to sell his house and move to my apartment because he no longer has money. The news spread like wildfire, and before long, every member of the family was at Carlos' house with expressions of shock and concern written on their faces. Carlos' 5 children immediately surrounded him, demanding explanations. "Daddy, what's going on? Why are you selling the house?" asked the eldest son. Carlos took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the words that were about to come out. "Children, I'm broke. All the money your mother left me is gone." There was a moment of tense silence, broken only by the muffled sound of surprised gasps. Carlos' children looked at him in astonishment, unable to believe what they were hearing. "What do you mean, Daddy? How did this happen?" asked the youngest daughter. Carlos looked down, feeling the shame and sadness weighing him down. I wasn't careful with the money. I spent more than I should have, invested in things that didn't work out, and now I have nothing left." The news fell like a bomb on the family, leaving everyone stunned and disoriented. They looked around at the house they had always considered a symbol of security and stability, now about to be sold. The reality of the situation began to set in, and they realized that the life they knew was about to change. Carlos took a deep breath, with a regretful look, reflecting the pain and frustration he was feeling. He stared at his children with a mixture of sadness and indignation. "You are here now demanding your share of the house. But where were you when I needed you most? When I was in the hospital fighting to recover, only Pedro was by my side. You didn't take a step towards me, you didn't visit each other, you didn't care to know how I was. And now that I'm selling the house to survive, everyone shows up wanting their share." There was a moment of heavy silence, in which the truth of Carlos' words hung in the air like a shadow over everyone present. Carlos' children looked down, feeling the hatred of rejection. The eldest son was the first to break the silence, his voice full of regret. "Dad, we made a mistake. We didn't realize how much you were suffering, how much you needed us. Please forgive us." Carlos sighed, feeling his children's sincere emotions. The love that still exists between you, despite the difficulties of the past. He continued, with a slow nod. "I forgive you, my children, but it's important for you to understand that this house is all I have now. I will sell it so I can live with dignity and hope we can find a way to move forward together as a family." Carlos' children nodded, pledging to support their father as best they could. They knew they had made mistakes, but they were determined to do things right this time. With heavy hearts, they said goodbye to Carlos, promising to return soon to help him transition into a new phase of his life. As the family dispersed, Letitia, who followed the entire conversation from afar, approached Carlos with her eyes full of concern. "Carlos, what's going on? Why didn't you tell me about this?" Carlos sighed, pretending to feel guilty for not sharing the truth with Letitia sooner. "Letitia, I didn't want you to worry. I was trying to protect her, protect our relationship, but now it seems like it's caused more problems." She nodded, placing a gentle hand on Carlos' face, looking into his eyes tenderly. "It's okay, Carlos. The future is only up to God, as we never know what tomorrow holds for us." The next day, while he was carefully folding his clothes, a message from Letitia arrived on his phone. He read it with a perplexed expression, and his eyes swept over the words over and over again. Letitia was leaving on a sudden trip, citing the need to be with her parents. It was then that Pedro entered the room, finding his grandfather lost in his thoughts. "Grandpa, is everything okay?" asked Pedro. Carlos sighed, feeling the weight of sadness in his heart. "I need to tell you something about Letitia. I never even kissed her, and now she said she's traveling and hasn't responded any further." Pedro's eyes widened, surprised by the revelation. "But Grandpa, you seemed so happy together. Carlos shook his head, his voice mournful. I thought she was here for me, but now I see that all she wanted was my money. She realized that I lost my fortune and preferred to leave. I just wanted to have someone by my side who really loved me. Pedro looked at his grandfather with compassion, feeling the sadness emanating from him. He wished he could comfort him, but he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to heal his pain. Grandpa, I'm sorry you're going through this, but know that you're not alone. I will always be here for you no matter what happens. Carlos then revealed that he was deeply disturbed when Letitia expressed her desire to be included in his will. Those moments revealed her true intentions, and he found himself confronted with the painful reality of having been used. Do you believe that, Pedro? He asked. Not long ago, she asked if I could include her in my will or make her a beneficiary on my life insurance policy. I should have suspected it before. However, I responded with a simple yes to Letitia's request. I didn't want to confront her at that moment, but I kept what I had just discovered in my mind. At the time, I didn't know what to say, so I agreed, saying that I would leave her a special legacy. Grandpa, you can't leave her anything, Pedro exclaimed with a mixture of indignation and concern. She used you. Grandpa, you can't leave her anything, Peter repeated. Carlos smiled mischievously, a mischievous gleam in his tired eyes. Don't worry, my boy. I have something much better planned for her. Pedro was perplexed by his grandfather's enigmatic answer, but decided to trust him. I knew Carlos had a plan, even if he didn't fully understand what it was. In the days that followed, Carlos left his luxurious home behind and went to live with Pedro in his modest apartment. The new routine was challenging for both of them, but they soon found their rhythm. During the day, Carlos spent much of his time alone, while Pedro was busy with work and studies. However, as soon as Pedro returned home, he devoted all his time and attention to his grandfather. Pedro did his best to make Carlos' life more comfortable and enjoyable. They shared meals together, watched television, and talked about a wide range of topics. As the days passed and the new routine was established, Carlos found himself faced with new challenges, especially in the kitchen. Used to counting on the maid's presence to prepare his meals, he now found himself having to learn to fend for himself. Luckily, his neighbor, Mariana, soon became a constant presence in his life. Mariana, a 22-year-old girl, lived in the house next door with her mother. She was kind, helpful, and always willing to help. Over time, Mariana began bringing the man breakfast, ensuring he didn't go hungry while he learned his way around the kitchen. In addition, Mariana often offered her help with other household tasks, from cleaning to small repairs around the house. Her warm presence and friendly smile made her a beloved figure in Carlos' life. Over time, their friendship grew stronger, and Carlos began to feel closer and closer to Mariana. His gentleness and kindness reminded him of his own grandson, Pedro. In his heart, he began to think of Mariana as his own granddaughter, a young woman he admired and wanted to protect. He began to affectionately call her my granddaughter, sharing stories and advice with her, as he did with Pedro. For Carlos, Mariana was more than just a neighbor. She was a source of comfort and joy in his lonely life. Mariana's presence brought new light to Carlos' life. He no longer felt so alone, as he now had not only Pedro's support, but also Mariana's sincere friendship. As the days passed, Carlos' life took new directions. Suddenly, a relationship between Pedro and Mariana began to blossom, fueled by the wise words and kind gestures of Carlos, who became Cupid himself between the two young lovers. Meanwhile, Letitia remained absent, lost in her own world, leaving behind memories of a past that should never have happened. She never looked for Carlos again or sent him news about how she was doing. As the years passed, age began to take its toll on Carlos, leaving visible marks on his body and spirit. Some illnesses began to emerge as unwanted reminders of an end that was approaching at any moment. Finally, the moment came when Carlos had to face the inevitability of his illnesses and found himself admitted to the hospital. There, he received constant visits from Pedro and Mariana, who continued to be his greatest source of support. One day, while lying in his hospital bed, Carlos called Pedro for a moment of private conversation. His tired eyes reflected a wisdom gained over the years, but also a calm serenity in the face of what was to come. "Pedro, my boy," began Carlos with a soft and calm voice, "I feel that my journey in this world is coming to an end. I've lived a full life filled with love, but now it's time to leave." Pedro felt his heart sink when he heard his grandfather's words, but he knew it was time to face reality. With tears in his eyes, he held Carlos' hand tenderly, unable to say the words that were stuck in his throat. Carlos looked into his grandson's eyes, tenderly, transmitting words of comfort and wisdom. "Don't cry, my boy. I'm ready to go. I've lived a life full of love and joy, and now it's time to say goodbye." With tears streaming down their faces, Pedro held Carlos' hand firmly, feeling the gravity of the moment. "Nobody knows when to leave, Grandpa," he murmured between sobs. Carlos smiled gently, and his eyes reflected a serenity that contrasted with his grandson's pain. "I know, my boy, but I feel like my time is coming." Pedro struggled to contain his emotions, but Carlos' words weighed on his heart like a stone. "Please, Grandpa, don't go. I'm not ready to lose you." Carlos held Pedro's hand affectionately, conveying words of comfort and wisdom. "Cry later, my boy. I had a happy life. I was a happy father despite everything, and that's all that matters." The two hugged, sharing a moment of tender farewell. Carlos then asked Pedro for one last thing, with his heart heavy with the weight of farewell. "Pedro, I would like you to bring the whole family together on the day of the will. Please promise me you will do this for me." Pedro nodded, unable to speak as the pain of loss weighed on him. "I promise, Grandpa. I will do it for you." A few days later, on the day of the will reading, Pedro called all the family members, including Leticia, who ran when she found out that Carlos had left her something. They gathered around the table, and their somber expressions reflected the gravity of the moment. Carlos' lawyer entered the room with a solemn aura, engaging himself as he addressed those present with a serious and controlled voice. He asked everyone's attention to show a video recorded by Carlos himself. In a ceremonial gesture, the lawyer turned on the video, and Carlos' figure appeared on the screen, his voice echoing through the room in a tone of deep sincerity and emotion. "My dear children, grandchildren, and friends," began Carlos with a voice full of determination. "For years, I lived the story of my life, my desires and my regrets." As the video continued, Carlos opened his heart, revealing his inner struggles, his silent loneliness, and his constant yearning for connection and love. He expressed his gratitude to Pedro and Mariana, recognizing them as the true pillars of his support and happiness in recent years. "I was lucky to find love and compassion in the arms of Pedro and Mariana. They gave me more than I could have ever hoped for, and for that I will be forever grateful." Carlos then shared his reasons for announcing the sale of the house and the choice to leave material wealth behind. He wanted to test his children's true character by revealing that despite their flaws, he still loved them deeply. "In fact, I never lost my savings. Money has always been with me. I invented selling the house as an excuse to find out who was truly on my side. I told Leticia that I would leave her a special inheritance, but in fact, I have something much better planned for her." As Carlos' video progressed, surprising revelations began to emerge, changing the course of the inheritance and stirring up mixed emotions in the room. Carlos, with a serenity worthy of a wise man, explained his decision to divide his inheritance differently among his loved ones, emphasizing that, despite the circumstances, his love for everyone remained unshakable. With impressive clarity, he outlined the details of the division of the inheritance. Half of his 15 million would be offered to Pedro, in addition to the house he loved so much, a significant amount that he deserved, according to Carlos. In turn, 20% of the amount would go to charity, and the other 30% would be divided between your children, ensuring that each one received their fair share. However, the biggest surprise was reserved for Mariana and Leticia. The young woman who had become his lover would be awarded Carlos life insurance worth 1 million Brazilian reals, a gesture that reflected the love and gratitude he felt for her, and that would guarantee her financial future. Meanwhile, Leticia would receive a key to a safe in the bank where Carlos kept his precious jewels, a gift that at first glance seemed modest, but which hid priceless wealth. According to his words, Leticia smiled upon hearing her share of the inheritance, convinced that she had received a smaller portion, but enough so that she would never need to work again. Leticia couldn't wait to discover the jewels that were stored in the safe, imagining the fortune she was about to inherit. As the room absorbed Carlos' revelations, a feeling of surprise and admiration came over everyone. The generosity and meticulous care with which he had planned his inheritance revealed the true nature of his character and the depth of his love for those he left behind. Carlos' words were still echoing through the room when Leticia left and headed to the bench with palpable anticipation, eager to discover the jewels she believed to be her inheritance. However, when she opened the safe, what she found was a bitter and unexpected surprise. In front of her, instead of shining jewels and promises of wealth, there was only a glass of cold coffee accompanied by a letter written in Carlos' hand. The words she found there cut her deeper than any dagger. "My dear Leticia," the letter began, and each word was an arrow piercing her heart. "To you, I leave this glass of cold, bitter coffee, as well as the love you gave me." Leticia felt her world collapsing around her. Tears flooded her eyes, and her heart broke into 1,000 pieces at the cruel revelation of the man she once tried to seduce to enrich herself at her expense. Desolate and aimless, she left the bank without knowing where to go or what to do. Sadness and regret weighed on her like an unbearable burden that she didn't know how to carry. On the other hand, Pedro and Mariana continued their lives in the house that once belonged to Carlos. Following in the footsteps of the man they loved so much, they kept Carlos' memory alive, remembering the precious moments they spent by his side and cherishing the legacy of love and generosity he left behind. For Pedro and Mariana, the house was not just a place to live, but a sanctuary of memories and affection, a constant reminder of the unconditional love that Carlos dedicated to them over the years that followed Mr. Carlos' departure. Pedro and Mariana carried with them not only the memory of a beloved man, but also his precious teachings and values. In the midst of life's challenges, they found strength and inspiration in the wise words and example of unconditional love that Carlos provided them. Whenever they felt discouraged or lonely, they remembered the lessons that Carlos valued so much. "The most important thing in life," Carlos used to say, "is to have people by your side who we love and who love us. The rest are just details." With Mr. Carlos' memory in their hearts, Pedro and Mariana lived their lives with gratitude and joy, carrying on the legacy of love and care he started. They embraced every moment with fervor, valuing every smile, every hug, and every shared memory. Wherever they went, Pedro and Mariana carried Carlos' spirit with them, spreading kindness and compassion wherever they went. As time progressed, they knew that as long as they had each other and Carlos' memory to guide them, they could face any challenge life threw at them. Thus, the story of love and care that Carlos cultivated continued to prosper, illuminating the hearts of those who were lucky enough to know him. And as the sun set over the horizon, Pedro and Mariana knew that they would keep Mr. Carlos' memory alive in their hearts and would always be happy and grateful for everything he did for them.